Hello, and welcome to another episode of Christians Squared, where pastors and professors come to discuss topics that are relevant to today's church, or as Chris and I call it, where eggheads talk. I'm Christian Mishagna, and I'm with my co-host Chris Fahey. And on this episode, we have as our guest Professor Roger Olson, who is an emeritus professor of theology at Truett Theological Seminary and at Baylor University. Professor Olson is an author of numerous books, but on this episode, we'll be discussing his latest work called Against Liberal Theology. Professor Olson, welcome to the episode. Can you just introduce yourself to our guests, give us a little brief understanding of your professional career and things like that?
Yes, one slight correction. I have a more recent book than Against Liberal Theology. It's called Unsafe Sects, SECTS.
Ooh.
And it is about cults. And so how to avoid them, how to recognize them, and how to avoid them. It's published by Whitman Stock out of Eugene, Oregon.
Well, you will be coming back on to discuss that with us soon.
And This is why, because I was kidnapped out of a Christian cult back in 39 years ago.
Don't tell me it was the Way International.
No, but it was close. It was Hobart E. Freeman and Faith Assembly out of North Central Indiana. So that's another topic. Right. Maybe we'll have you back for that, because we could both talk for a long time. Anyway,
off the bat, you struck a nerve.
I'll keep it brief. I don't like to talk about myself. I like to tell stories. My wife's sitting here, so I've got to be honest. I love to tell stories about myself, but I don't like to talk about my professional career as much. Professionally, I have always been a theologian professionally in my career. I graduated from North American Baptist Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is now called something else. I'm not sure what it is. Like most seminaries, it's kind of evolving and changing. I haven't really kept up with it, but it was a moderate Baptist seminary of the North American Baptist Conference, the old German Baptist Conference. I think they have another name now. I'm not sure. I can't keep up with all the name changes. And then I went on to Rice University in Houston, Texas, which is a secular university, but has a religious studies department, to earn my post-seminary master's degree and PhD in religious studies. At that time, when I went to Rice University, most of the professors were theologians or biblical scholars. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. But I went there to study under a Southern Baptist philosopher of religion named John Newport. And he left soon after I arrived there, but I still had a wonderful experience, earned my PhD, and studied in Germany while I was still a student at Rice University. They sent me to Germany to study with a theologian named Wolfhart Pannenberg.
Oh, okay.
And I wrote my doctoral dissertation under him while I was there in Germany, although I actually finished it after I returned to the United States. And my first teaching post was at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I taught theology for 2 years. And I didn't find myself in sympathy with what I was hearing in in the chapel. So I left there and went to Bethel College, now Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, taught there for 15 years, and then went to Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and taught there in their seminary for 22 years. I'm now in retirement, but I still write and keep up a blog almost every day, and preach at a Baptist church twice a month in Denver, and attend a Mennonite church. And my wife and I are members of a Mennonite church here.
Fantastic.
Wow, that's pretty extensive.
Well, I'm old, so what do you expect?
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Well, in your book, if we could jump right into not your latest work, Against Liberal Theology, you describe something that I experienced as a pastor, this huge swing from folks who find themselves in a fundamentalist kind of setting, and they swing right over into a liberal theological setting. Do you know of any markers or anything that's possibly causing that? Is there a movement that's drawing people that way today, or anything like that?
Most of the people I know who are doing that grew up in or were part of a church that at least they consider harsh and dogmatic, narrow-minded. And at some point, they began to rebel against that because they found it too stifling, and began to read. Someone maybe slipped them a book by Richard Rohr or Marcus Borg or someone else that's more liberal, and they found that refreshing, and so they headed in that direction and didn't know where to stop, and eventually found themselves, or others found them, in the borderlands of liberal theology, if not right in the middle of it. And I've seen that happen with many of my students over the years. And usually I can trace it back to a disillusionment with the church that they grew up in, or the church that they were in for a while before they went in that direction. And looking into whatever that church was, it was like the church I grew up in, which was, I'd say, anti-intellectual or anti-inquiry, not allowing honest questions and not answering honest questions, not giving them good stuff to read that's moderate theologically rather than either fundamentalist or liberal. And they just didn't know where else to go to escape the dogmatism and perhaps anti-intellectualism of the church they grew up in. And that's my almost universal experience with the people I'm writing this book to and about.
That is interesting. It almost seems like, and we were talking about this before we started taping, that a lot of people find themselves leaving fundamentalism and leaving, in some cases, leaving evangelicalism, because in your book you give a quote that one has said that fundamentalism is orthodoxy gone cultic. Okay. And it almost seems as if they're not really getting offended by the doctrinal orthodoxy as much as by the style of fundamentalism. I mean, I had a college professor, not in the seminary, this was back in the 80s, who had come from an environment like that. I know Bishop Spong, when you dig down and excavate his life, it started, and his disillusionment with fundamentalism and his complete shift to liberalism was rooted in that same thing. And so you're seeing, is that a fair read, that people are being offended not so much by perhaps a fundamentalist church's adherence to the apostles or the Nicene Creed, as much as by their style and the way that the way they handle people? Yes,
I agree. That's what I was really trying to say, that it's more the style. Although often in these churches, the students I've talked to report that they didn't learn any theology in church, so they didn't know where to turn. And someone handed them a book, or they came across a book in a library or something. And now, on the other hand, some of them turned to the Catholic Church to find roots, and a few to the Eastern Orthodox churches. So there's kind of a split between these kinds of people who are reacting to the style that you're describing in their church. And either they tend to go to hyper-Orthodoxy, and I mean by that traditionalism, Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, or some kind of Anglican, not Episcopal, but Anglican, or they turn to liberal theology without knowing it. They don't necessarily know that term or know what that is. So that's why I wrote the book, is to get it out there into the churches and into the seminaries and colleges. This is what liberal theology is. Watch out. You may be headed there, and it's not Christianity. Okay, so if somebody were to come to you, Professor Olson, and say, can you give me an elevator pitch on what is the essence of liberal theology, how would you answer that question, within a minute's time? Well, there's no simple definition of it, but one theologian named Claude Welch defined it as maximal acknowledgement of the claims of modernity. And I think we could add postmodernity. So maybe maximal acknowledgement of the claims of culture, of what's happening in the culture around us that may be contrary to traditional Christianity. And liberal theology, as I read it and study it and have described it, tends to keep asking the world, what can we still believe? And redefining Christianity that way. It's embracing whatever of Christianity doesn't conflict with what is considered the best of contemporary secular thought.
Almost like the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, and if you were to say, like, what would be a liberal theology creed today, what would that sound like?
One critic of liberal theology quite a long time ago was H. Richard Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr's brother at Yale University. And he described it as a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. And I would say that's still true, but of course you have to go deeper than that. There is no creed of liberal, I hesitate to say Christianity because it's not Christianity, but liberal theology. They're shy of creeds. They're shy of dogmas. And I would say the essence of it, to put it another way, is doctrine doesn't matter. All that matters is lifestyle. And ethics replaces doctrine, or spiritual formation replaces doctrine, or both. Ethics and spiritual formation, as they define both, replace doctrine. Liberal churches, liberal denominations, institutions, theologians really don't have doctrines as such. And if they do, they're always open to revision in light of new discoveries, as they think they are discoveries of science and philosophy.
Okay, so it's kind of an evolution then.
It's always changing, but there are certain unchanging characteristics or features, and they all go back to Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of modern theology, who lived and worked in Germany in the early 1800s. And he really set the path for liberal theology by saying that what really matters in religion generally, but in Christianity as well, is God consciousness. And it's kind of I hesitate to say mystical because people misunderstand that term a lot of times, but it's an experiential thing that really makes doctrine secondary, if not tertiary, third, to experience. But the experience is a very amorphous kind of experience of God called God consciousness.
Yeah, and and let me test this, and this is coming from a pastor. So, but it seems like the only thing that's heterodoxical in liberal theology is the word "no."
Or heresy.
Yeah, heresy. Heresy. That was probably a better word. The only heresy is to tell them no.
Well, even Friedrich Schleiermacher and other liberal theologians have held beliefs. I think it would be unfair to them to say they didn't believe anything, but their beliefs are always open to revision given what secular culture is saying.
That's interesting. Thomas Oden, in his book, The Rebirth of Orthodoxy, of course, you cited him in your book, and we're big fans of Oden. And one of the things that when he was a liberal theologian, and then his Jewish colleague Will Heberg called him out on it and says, "You don't even know your own history." And one of the things was, and so we talked about how he went back and started reading the patristics, and he basically made it his life's mission, and he fulfilled it, to offer nothing new, which was kind of the antithesis of what was expected of him as a liberal theologian. But one of the things that he talked about with Orthodoxy being, experiencing a rebirth, is the idea of that there are distinctions, that there are fences, and that there are boundaries. And one of the things that I was struck with, even though I told the guys this morning, I sent them an email. It says, Dr. Olson is clear and incisive, but he's not really polemical, at least like Walter Martin. But you make no bones about it, probably 4 or 5 times in the book that I saw, where you said liberal Christianity really shouldn't be called Christianity. You say that in one way or another because it's, you cited Walter Lippmann, the great journalist, when talking about Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism. He's saying liberalism isn't even Christianity.
Right. He wasn't a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he was just a commentator, yeah.
But he knew Christianity, and he recognized the difference between any kind of Christianity that's ever been known or thought of in the past and modern liberal theology. They're not the same at all.
Mm-hmm. Do you find yourself because I'm thinking as we're having this discussion, I'm reminded of something that Francis Schaeffer, he in his last book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, he talks about being on a radio program with a liberal theologian or a liberal pastor, and Schaeffer would constantly go back to the scriptures to back up what he said. And the whole book, by the way, was saying that if we've got a weakened view of the authority of scripture, it's going to undermine the foundation of the church. And so he would challenge this liberal theologian with chapter and verse, and then the liberal theologian would say, "But no, I appeal to Jesus." And Schaeffer would come back and say something like this: "Well, on the basis of what? What Jesus are you appealing to?" Do you find at times that you have to engage with your students and with other people and kind of break the news to them that, look, what you're going after is not Christianity? And how do you go about doing that? And because part of the reason for this podcast is having teachers like yourself speak to pastors who are on the front lines dealing with people who are deconstructing their faith. I mean, that's going on all over the place, as you guys know. So how would you speak to pastors to keep people from embracing something that's not really even substantially Christian at all?
There are so many possible answers to that question, and one that jumps to mind is to ask them and even tell them to read good Christian literature. Read G.K. Chesterton, Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
Read C.S. Lewis, not just his nonfiction fantasy books or science fiction books, but read Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, Miracles, The Abolition of Man, his essays, and so forth. Read Odin. Read good Christian books that aren't liberal, and see that there is an intellectual tradition of Orthodox Christianity. And this is why I wrote my book, if I can plug one of them, The Story of Christian Theology.
Go right ahead.
Please.
One of my best-selling books is The Story of Christian Theology. So it's a daunting book. It's 600 and some pages long, but it covers the whole scope of Christian theology from the church fathers, second century church fathers, up to today. And there's actually a sequel to it that's even longer called The Journey of Modern Theology, where I talk about 19th and 20th century theology and where it went wrong. And pastors need to read something other than the popular stuff that's fluffy. Mm-hmm. And I hate to label any book fluffy, but there are, the shelves of Christian bookstores, those that still exist, are, in my opinion, mostly fluff. And there's a lot of stuff being passed around for pastors to read. Parishioners coming up and handing them books and saying, read this, read this, read this. And some of it is just garbage.
Oh, yeah.
And they need to dig deeper into the wells of Christian theology, Orthodox Christian theology, and know what it is. I had a professor in seminary, and this is jumping a little bit, who had us read broadly. And some of the students complained that some of the theologians he was having us read were modern liberal theologians. And his answer was, if reading these liberal theologians causes you to appreciate the riches of your own evangelical heritage, he said, if it causes you to be stung, then so be it, be stung. In other words, read broadly, read deeply, compare. And this liberal theology is fluffy. It's shallow. It may have a surface appearance of being deep, but it's not. There's nothing deep about it. It's just talking back to secular culture, what secular culture is already saying, but with a spiritual veneer thrown over it. And there's just nothing there. It kills the church, by the way.
Yeah, it smells and bells, right? It's a shell. It's a 67 Bullitt Mustang without an engine in it.
Just look at what it's done to the mainline denominations. They're all dying because of liberal theology.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was asked to do a wedding for a young couple that was attending the church I was pastoring at the time. And this is probably about 15 years ago. And I sat down with them and I began to explain the gospel to them. And they were like, no, that's kind of like how we believe. And they began to share what they believed with me. And I had to say, I think you're more Buddhist than Christian. What they found was highly offensive, but I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. And then when I explained the gospel, it's so violent. It's so bloody, and is that kind of what we're seeing with this new run at liberal theology?
Well, that's one thing, certainly. The Nonviolent Atonement books with that title and like that are coming out, and some of my students were more than ready to embrace that. And it does away with the atonement. In the end, there is no atonement. Jesus' death was just a martyrdom. Well, who cares then? Again, it's just shallow. Liberal theology is shallow, even when it comes in the guise of being very deep. And in the book, I quote liberal theologians, and one that I quote that I really, really enjoyed reading was Douglas Otati's Christian Theology for the 21st Century. Deep, deep book. At least it appeared to be.
Yeah.
But no depth, in my opinion. I mean, it's just, spiritual fluff. I mean, he interacts with a lot of philosophies, with science, with ecology, with all kinds of movements and so forth. And that makes up most of the book, is interacting with those. But when it comes down to what does he actually believe doctrinally, I couldn't really tell. Maybe I didn't read it well, but I read it twice and underlined a lot of it. And I quote him extensively in the book. So that's just the most recent example of what appears to be really deep, profound liberal theology. But in the end, it cuts the cord between it and traditional classical Christianity so much that I couldn't recognize it as Christianity as I understand Christianity at all.
I had a conversation with one of our professors. You may know him, Douglas Cullum at Northeastern, some years back, and I was in my own faith tradition. There was a decidedly unintellectual bent, and it was difficult for a guy like me to be there. And it's a Pentecostal charismatic tradition, and I said, this is a problem in my faith tradition. I said, my seminary education, it's almost useless here. And he said, Christian, here's the thing you need to understand. This is not just a Pentecostal charismatic thing. He says, evangelicalism and fundamentalism itself is suspicious of the life of the mind. And so it almost sounds like, because you're saying on the one hand, liberal theology is fluff. On the other hand, what we're dealing with is colleagues, in some cases, seminary educated guys and gals who have no desire to read or to learn. And it almost seems like it's a setup, the unwillingness to dig down in it. And some books take a lot more effort. The popular books today, those are easy reads.
Yeah.
But if you're reading Thomas Oden, if you're reading Pannenberg or whatever, you're gonna have to work for it. But the gold is better. And so speak to that, if you could. Speak to that kind of suspicion of the life of the mind, especially in pastors.
Mark Knoll has written the classic about that, of course, called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. It's now in its revised edition, which I reviewed recently for, I think it was Christian Scholars Review, which I used to be editor of. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it, although I don't really agree with him that the holiness tradition is especially to blame for evangelical anti-intellectualism. I thought you'd want to hear that. I don't agree with him that that's a particular problem. I think it's across the board. He's Presbyterian, and he would like to, all evangelicals, I assume, to become Presbyterian. I kind of heard him say that when he spoke in convocation at Truett Seminary. At least I thought I was hearing him say something like that. I think American culture itself is anti-intellectual. And we give in to culture when we become anti-intellectual. Now, I don't want to promote myself, but I've spent my whole career as a theologian trying to write good theology for lay people. And I think all of my books can be read by any college student, maybe most high school graduates. You don't have to be a scholar, an expert. You don't have to be even an intellectual to read most of my books. I'd say maybe all of them. But what I've tried to do is fill that gap and say, here are some books that you can read and understand that will tell you the richness of our evangelical heritage, trans-denominationally, not pinned to a particular tradition or denomination, but modern Christian orthodoxy. And, you know, they've sold fairly well. I'm not sure how much of a difference they've made. I hope they've made some impact. But I think the drift of American culture and American Christianity included is so powerfully in the direction of experiential entertainment, you know, just what we call spirituality in a very broad sense, away from the life of the mind. And that's so sad to me. It breaks my heart because there's so much richness in traditional Christian theology. And Thomas Oden, you know, latched on to the church fathers, and that's fine. You know, I knew Thomas Oden. We had our differences. But the last time I saw him, he apologized to me, which I appreciated, because
that's good.
He gave me a tongue lashing in a public event because I defended open theism as not process theology, which he believed it is. And there's a definite difference there. But you know, I respect him, but I think he latched on to the church fathers a little too much. There's also the reformers. There's also post-Reformation theologians, Wesley and the Pietists and the Princeton theologians, and even into the 20th century. You know, I would defend Karl Barth as an evangelical, even though I know a lot of evangelicals don't think so, but I wonder whether they've actually read him. They read secondary literature too often and don't read the theologians themselves. So there's much for them to do to come to appreciate and hold on to their evangelical heritage. There's a lot of books they can read.
Well, as big Oden fans, we give you a big shout out for getting an apology from Tom Oden.
Yeah, I know he wasn't known for that.
You mentioned the idea of like putting the brakes on progressive Christianity. As a pastor, like how could we do that, or in that vacuum that's been created where people are kind of swinging and cutting the tether and swinging into liberal theology, what could we do to kind of stem the tide?
Well, you can do a lot, but you need your denomination support to really carry it off. I think one of the big problems in the United Methodist Church, in my opinion, was that the denomination's leaders didn't support the pastors when they tried to put the brakes on progressive Christianity and stop the rise of liberal theology in the seminaries. And of course, that's led to the situation now where the United Methodist Church is dividing. Again, it's happened in the past. A lot of people don't know about the split of the Nazarene Church from the Methodist Church back in the early 20th century, and others, such as Free Methodists in the 19th century that left. But, you know, pastors are on the forefront of this. And when I was in Waco toward the end of my career there of teaching, I had a pastor who came into our church and led a 6-week Sunday morning adult Sunday school class, all adult Sunday school classes together on the Nicene Creed.
Oh, wow.
Now, that was different because Southern Baptists, or at least the more moderate Southern Baptist churches, don't consider themselves creedal. We don't say creeds in church and so forth, not even the Apostles' Creed. But he led a study of the Nicene Creed, unpacked it, explained why it came into, how it came into existence, or why it's still relevant to Christians today. And, you know, some people shrugged it off and didn't take it very seriously. They thought it was just a historical relic that he was talking about. Others took it seriously, but I was proud of him for doing that. It was kind of courageous on his part, I think, because Southern Baptists pride themselves so much on not being creedal. At least the non-fundamentalist Southern Baptists do. So that's one thing I think, you know, a pastor can do is say, hey, we're going to have a 6-week Sunday morning Sunday school class, and all the adult classes are going to come together, and we're going to talk about the Nicene Creed, or we're going to talk about John Wesley and his appreciation of the creeds of Christianity. And, you know, we're going to get back to the roots, like Thomas Oden was big on doing. and just show them that there's much to be appreciated there, and that really Christianity is a set of doctrines as well as certain experiences, and you can't change it that much and still call it Christianity. It's dishonest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the creed. I was raised Roman Catholic and confirmed Roman Catholic, and then soon became a Protestant. And you mentioned earlier on that the Way International, and I can remember my brother talking to a fellow who said, I just got born again, and I'm part of a church called the Way International. And he started talking about God is non-Trinitarian. And my brother and I went right back to the creed.
Yeah.
So what I did in that case was I went and got the book, Jesus Christ is Not God, by the founder,
Victor Paul
Wierwille, and I read it. And then I taught a class on it in our church and also in our Christian coffee house ministry at the time when the Way International was very strong.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I had some Way people come and confront me. I also did that with other groups that were, you know, so-called cults that were rising up and so forth. And we just always gently and in a Christian love way confronted their teachings. Yeah. Not necessarily them as persons, but their teachings, and said, this is not what we as Christians believe, because the Bible teaches something different.
Interesting.
I don't find that as common today. That's almost a foreign concept today in most churches to do that.
Well, 100 years ago, you would have heresy trials in churches. It was your doctrinal, your adherence to certain creeds, doctrines, dogma, it either kept you in or kept you out. And I don't know that even goes on anymore. Yeah, there are excommunications, usually from some sort of misbehavior, probably sexual. But the idea of a trial of heresy, saying, look, what you're now, you know, with the history of the Catholic Church, that they've got, it's now the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, but for years it was the congregation of the doctrine of the faith. They regularly serve notice to theologians who are writing things that were heterodox in terms of the church's historic position, but also of the doctrinal formulations in the Apostles' and Nicene creeds. And they were very carefully articulated, but they would call them out and say, look, we serve notice on Roger Haight's book, you know, Jesus, the symbol of God, or something like that.
Or Hans Kung, who I knew personally.
Kung, yeah. Oh, really?
Was Hans Kung's chauffeur for 4 days.
Did you really? Okay.
At a conference in Houston, Texas. And he was the most arrogant theologian I think I've ever met.
Kind of like an oxymoron, I think.
He knew he was famous. Let's put it that way.
And he got stripped of his teaching privileges by the church.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Let's put it this way. Catholic students could no longer take courses under him for the priesthood, toward their ordination. He was no longer considered a canonical Catholic teacher. Yeah. And that was Benedict XVI, before he became Pope, who did that. And so I respected the Catholic Church for doing that, because I read his book on being a Christian, and the Christology was terrible.
Okay.
Just out and out liberal.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in any way that I could tell in the deity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
But here's the slippery thing. Liberal theologians will say, oh, I do believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. You have to ask more questions than that.
Well, you have to define the terms. That seems to be part of the dance with heterodox theologies in general. Is the first thing you have to do.
Illustration of that. When I was at Brigham Young University, and I've been there 3 times for dialogue events, they sat me down at the end of the weekend and they said, Professor Olson, do you believe we're Christians? And I said, do you believe Jesus Christ is God? And they said, yes. But see, I know better than to stop there. I said, has he always been God? Oh, no. See, you have to ask more than the surface questions.
Yeah.
It's like when I was director of a Christian coffee house, when I was in seminary, And I gave a talk on a Saturday evening, and it was packed. There were a lot of people there because there was a group, I hesitate to call it a cult, but there was a new group in town called the Holy Order of Mans, M-A-N-S.
Okay.
They had a lot of New Age beliefs, reincarnation and so forth, and they were drawing people to their house where they lived. They lived semi-monastically and everything. Well, I read their books, and I realized this is not what I believe as a Christian. It's not even close. It's esoteric Christianity.
Sure.
And so I gave a talk about it. They were sitting right there in front of me, 2 or 3 of them. Afterwards, we went out onto the sidewalk, and people kind of gathered around us, and we were continuing to dialogue, maybe somewhat debate. And a man that I knew, a Christian man, pulled up in his pickup truck, jumped out, listened for just a minute, and then grabbed me and them around the neck and said, around the necks, and said, "Do you both love Jesus?" And of course they said, "Yes."
Yeah.
And I said, "Yes, but wait." And he took off in his pickup truck after saying, "That's all that matters." No, it's not.
Which Jesus are you talking about? There are other Jesuses. Yeah. Paul warned about that.
Exactly. But see, this is really one of the hallmarks of progressive Christianity, is the saying, "I follow Jesus, not Paul." And I've heard that 100 times, maybe more. And it's a cliche, almost a mantra for progressive Christians on their way to becoming liberal.
Yeah, it's a false dichotomy.
And they're going back to Thomas Jefferson's Jefferson Bible, the life and morals, or the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Maybe I can't remember the full title. We just call it Jefferson's Bible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're doing is not with a literal scissors, but with a mental scissors, cutting out everything in the New Testament that doesn't fit with their modern or postmodern mindset and what they want to be true.
It's almost like a cafeteria Christianity.
Yeah, we Scandinavians have a better term, smorgasbord.
Well said.
And, as a pastor of a church, what authors should we be leery of? Are there some that are more deviant in their? Are they purposely trying to take Orthodox people away into more liberal theology? Do I ask him to throw some people under the bus, Chris?
Well, who are some? I think it's a valid question.
You're nicer than I am, so you ask it.
You're from New Jersey, so he gets to the point. I guess. I mean, you've identified numerous liberal theological voices, starting with Schleiermacher, coming through and including Ritschl and Harry Emerson Fosdick, and coming up to our present time with Bishop Spong and Marcus Borg, who are the kinds of authors that, look, these are popular religious writers who have the Christian nomenclature, the Christian smells and bells, but there's nothing under the hood that really is identifiably Christian. Or if you're uncomfortable with that, say you've cited Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. Who else could people read that would keep you, obviously? Well, that's a given. Okay.
So there's a book I wrote called Essentials of Christian Thought.
Okay.
That's a place to start.
Yep.
It's published by Zondervan.
Okay.
This book, of course, The Mosaic of Christian Belief, published by InterVarsity Press, is very accessible. It's not as long as The Story of Christian Theology. So, look at my Amazon page and see. Scott McKnight is another person I strongly recommend for people to read. Brian Zahnd is someone that I like a lot. He's an envelope pusher, but I don't consider him progressive in this sense or liberal or anything like that. But I'm trying to get students to read evangelical Christians who aren't fundamentalist, because their minds are usually closed to that, and they sniff it out right away and close the book and put it back on the shelf or throw it away or burn it. So some of these more progressive, perhaps, but not liberal, not on the road to liberal. I would say Scott McKnight is not on the road to liberal. I would even say Greg Boyd is one of my favorite authors. He's a dear friend of mine. We taught together at Bethel University. He's not guilty of a lot of the things he's accused of all the time. He is a heartfelt, born-again, charismatic Christian and a deep biblical thinker, though his conclusions may not always be the same as many other more conservative evangelicals. He's been attacked, I think, unfairly, especially by the Calvinists.
Well, Greg Boyd, I mean, he paid a terrible price for his integrity back during the time of the Gulf War, or the War on Terror.
I was his colleague, and I left Bethel College partly because of the conflict between John Piper and his followers and Greg Boyd. Yeah. And it was very unfair, in my opinion. But those are some of the people. But, I'd say for most, it's a good place to start with C.S. Lewis. Just read C.S. Lewis. But I'm not talking about the fiction. I'm talking about his theological apologetic
Christianity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Screwtape. Yeah.
Oh, the Screwtape letters are great. There's something a lot of people don't know about C.S. Lewis and his books. He hated the Screwtape letters. He thought it was his worst book, and he was almost ashamed of it for some reason. I'm not sure why. And his favorite book that he wrote was Till We Have Faces, which is one of his least known books.
Yeah.
And I read it and couldn't make any sense out of it whatsoever. So I never recommended it to anyone. But I think the Screwtape Letters is one of his best books.
It's brilliant. Yeah, it is. No question.
So let me tell you a story about this book that we're talking about. So we're talking about Against Liberal Theology. That's the title I came at the publisher with, and they agreed to it, but then they changed their mind. And not Zondervan, but their owner, the company that owns Zondervan, didn't want it to be called Against Liberal Theology because they thought that was too harsh. But I had put in the contract that had to be the title, so I forced them to stick to it.
Good for you.
And they wanted the title to be the subtitle. Something like Putting the Brakes on Progressive Christianity, but I said, no, that remains as the subtitle. But this is, to me, emblematic of a lot of modern day Christianity, that we're wimpish, we cower before, I don't want to say the enemy, but toward the alternatives, and we don't want to be strong in our adherence to classical Christianity, and by that I mean broadly, Orthodox Christianity. We need, in our churches, and I'll say the Free Methodist Church needs to hold to it strongly and let go people who don't. And instead, a lot of Christian colleges and universities and seminaries are wimping out, and I'm not going to name any, but saying things like, well, you can stay on our faculty and not believe what we believe.
Yeah.
What? That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't help but wonder if what is happening on the one hand is by taking all of our markers and our bearings from what's going on and what's popular in the culture, and then maybe what our youngest believers who are coming up into their teen years and into their 20s, maybe what they really want is something with teeth on it and something to die for.
Well, this is the whole explanation of the rise of the young restless reform movement. Back in the 90s and the first decade of this century and even to today, 60,000 Christian young people flock to the Passion Conference every year in Atlanta to hear John Piper and Louis Giglio and all these wonderful speakers who are Calvinists. And I'm going, you don't have to go to Calvinism to find this. By this I mean Orthodox Christianity with teeth, with depth, with thickness. But they do. That's the only thing they can find that's doctrinally thick is Calvinism. And so I wrote my book Against Calvinism and Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities in order to show them that there is an alternative that's still under the umbrella of Orthodox Christianity.
Very good.
Yeah, I think in some of the seminaries and the churches, their fear of losing either a student or a congregant and bending and swinging more to a liberal theology, they keep the congregant or the student, but they lose the gospel. And we've seen what's happened in some of the traditional, the Episcopal Church and things like that. And as a pastor, I recently did a funeral within the last 3 months of someone who was murdered, and here I am with a family. Um, Without Christ and the gospel, I don't know what you have to tell those people. Feel good, but I'm able to present to them a God who understands what it's like to experience tragedy, trauma, death, a God who
Yeah.
understands what this family has gone through and is going through, versus
And what they
some.
can look forward to.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'll tell you what a lot of liberal theology leads to is a funeral my wife and I attended for her grandfather.
Hmm.
And the Lutheran minister, who was liberal theologically, said over the casket to the congregation, the family, Helmer, that's her grandfather's name, he was a Norwegian immigrant. Helmer is dead. We will never see Helmer again, but God holds him in his memory.
Oh,
What on earth is that? I read that in your
That's
book.
process theology. I
yeah.
went up to him afterwards and I said, have you been influenced by process theology, which is probably the most dominant form of liberal theology? And he said, oh, yes, I studied that at Luther Seminary. And he started naming liberal theologians who I personally knew because I live very near Luther Seminary. And
Sure.
I knew them. I spoke there. And I said, shame on you for saying that with my wife's grandmother, the widow, sitting right there.
Yeah.
Shame on you.
Yeah.
And he just turned around and walked away.
Wow.
Wow. Okay.
So this is what liberal theology is. And a lot of people don't know it because they think it's just modern, updated, relevant theology. But there's so much more to it. It's so much worse than that.
Yeah.
And if they don't know, they need to read my book. And I'll tell you, most of them don't know. And they need to read the book. Another reason I wrote the book is coming out of a Southern Baptist context. A lot of Southern Baptists think liberal theology is anything different from what their pastor says.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so I want them, mostly fundamentalists, to know, oh no, liberal theology is something entirely different. And it's out there. And you need to stop calling that liberal theology. For example, at Truett Seminary, I heard people calling the seminary liberal, and it was not at all.
No.
But they didn't really know what liberal theology was, and they'd hear that a professor said something in class that was new to them that they didn't already think, and they say, "Oh, that must be liberal." No, that's
And they
not.
didn't bother thinking it through.
And I've heard Greg Boyd called liberal. He's anything but liberal. He believes in spiritual warfare.
Oh yeah, and I've heard the same thing. When I had plugged to a friend of mine whose father was in a church that I pastored, not while I was pastoring, but he himself is now a fundamentalist pastor. And I had quoted favorably Brian Zahnd, and his son came over and says, "I'm really suspicious of Brian Zahnd." I think Brian Zahnd wrote "A Farewell to Mars," right? That was Brian Zahnd. And he was just immediately, if it was something new that they're not familiar with, or if they were challenging the kind of Christian nationalism that is so powerful, they sort of conflated the two.
Yes.
And made liberalism is somebody who maybe someone might be liberal if they're questioning the validity both presently and historically of any kind of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Anybody who's not a dispensationalist is liberal.
Okay.
I've been told. And on and on and on. So that's another reason I wrote the book, is to inform people what liberal theology really is.
Well, I think you've succeeded.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Dr. Olson, for coming on the program.
Yes.
We'd like to thank everyone who's tuned in and checking out Christian Squared. Again, want to give a big shout out to Professor Olson. The link to his website and his blog will be provided on our website and Facebook page. I'd like to also invite you to like us and share it with someone that you think they might enjoy this. Also want to mention that Christian Squared is sponsored by New Life CNY, which is a gospel-centered church looking to help people learn to live life through the power of the gospel, located outside of Syracuse, New York. the Great White North. So again, thank you, Dr. Olson, for coming on. We look forward to getting you on again and talk about your latest book. I put that correction in there. So thanks for tuning in.
Unsafe Sects.
Unsafe Sects. SECTS.
Right.
About cults.
Yes.
Thank you for spelling that,
you.
Chris. Okay. Thanks for coming on. God bless.
Thanks so much, sir. Blessings.